Hey, hi, I'm Jean-Michel from Action Against Hunger. Just a quick question about the you mentioned that, Rihanna, you mentioned a lot about the context. Should we adapt the ethics on the context? My question is to say that, and Hugo, you mentioned that the code of conduct, which is the base of your books, are the key principle. If we turn around and we looked through the eyes of the people who are suffering and waiting for the assistance, and often we are being challenged, they don't understand our values, they don't understand why we don't provide them with some assistance because we don't want to have an army escort, we don't want to have anything. If you made a study from their eyes and their lens, what are the values or the ethics that you think will be the most challenge from the code of conduct?
Jean-Michel, thank you very much. Please, at the front there, thank you.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Raquel Vázquez from the European Interagency Security Forum. My question connects the second passage that Hugo has read and the idea of raw morality. So I would like to know if you think that humanitarian organizations have the ethical obligation to contribute to international justice efforts. So what I'm trying to say here is that generally they are first responders. They are witnessing atrocities. This makes them very good witnesses in case international tribunals are set up or any kind of prosecutions happen in the context of war crimes. And then they always deny to testify. So do you think that in this case there would be this idea of humanity before humanitarian principles? Our idea of humanity as human beings should go first than the idea of humanity as humanitarian workers, if you have the position to contribute to these justice efforts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for that good question. Sir, please.
Mansoor Ali from International Medical Corporation, Senior Advisor. I was thinking about the book, and it's really very refreshing for me. I'm new to this area. But one thing which I constantly, my mind was taking me to that good point, and that is about why morality is not a discussion point in policy arena. And in my previous work with charities, we constantly struggle a lot that is it a human resource management issue, and do we need to deal with the HR department, or is it a policy? And it never found a place in the policy department or with policy people. So in your role as head of policy, I would like to to know a bit now or later that is this a real struggle? Where is the place for morality in the charity sector overall? Thank you.
Mansoor, thank you very much for that question, which reflects another question I've got coming through here, and it's to do with professionalisation and lack of ethics and so on. So the question is from. It's from Lucio Melandri again. He's playing a lot of attention here. In the last 20 years, he says, humanitarian organisations have focused on professionalisation, increasing standards and techniques. Has enough attention been given to ethics, which I think was your point. Mark, please. I think you had your hand up earlier. Thank you.
Hi, Marc Dubois. First, thank you, Hugo, for this book, and thank you to both Alice and Rihanna for very, very thoughtful commentary. I think in some ways, I had another question, but I think I'll try and follow up a little bit on maybe what's been asked here. And I guess, I worked for years with MSF, and probably twice a year, the medical department of MSF Holland invited a medical ethicist in. I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but brilliant guy. And what was important was the way in which he just fielded problems from our field staff. And he wasn't smarter than them, he wasn't certainly more experienced than them, but because he had an ethical framework, and all of the medical people have, they're familiar with medical ethics and trained in it. But here's somebody who is clearly a level up, and he was able to really bring some clarity into what seemed like very heart-wrenching dilemmas at the field level. And I guess I understand what you said about this book kind of hopefully will help us with these questions of what does it mean to close a project.
Yeah.
I guess the question is, I mean, how many people will read the book? Hopefully, some of the leadership. No, I don't mean it in a negative way, but I think an organization that did not have psychological support for staff now, mental health support, would be looked at as a bit, substandard practice. And I'm wondering, should we have, hospitals have ethicists on board. Should we have ethicists on board? These questions are really, they're not for amateurs. I will read this book. I hope, as a philosophy major 30 years ago, I hope I can read it. But, we need support here. And should we operationalize this, which in some ways gets back to that policy question.
And Mark, how do you think we should, I mean, have you any ideas about how to operationalise this?
We hire Hugo away from the ICRC. No, I think, I think it would be very hard to sort of have in-house, I do think, the same way the medical department of MSF Holland did, you make some connections with universities, you go back to people year after year. In the beginning, maybe they don't quite get humanitarianism, but after a while they do, and they learn with you, and you support them, but you create a few resources like that, and you engage with them from time to time.
Good. We'll take one more, and then we'll go to the panel. Please.
Thanks, Katie Atfield, currently independent. Thank you very much, all of you. It's a bit following on from Mark's comment, actually, in a way, which is, as you know very well, Hugo, ICRC, together with British Red Cross, has been working for years now on a study into customary IHL, which is the best one can do in terms of how to apply IHL, or how to look at how states and other parties apply IHL in the real context. And it strikes me that, what I'd like to see as a kind of, together with this book, which I haven't read yet, but I will, is a workbook for the humanitarian in the field that actually has a bit where they can write down, today I faced this one, and I made this decision, and I based it on this ethics. And to use that in such a way that we kind of gather much more jurisprudence in a very practical way on this subject, because I do think that it is still much too much only a sphere of academic. I totally agree that it is not for amateurs. We need a lot of help on it, but we also need it to be applicable to the grunt like me.
And Katie, just to reflect your question, another one coming up here on my, whatever it's called. It's not an iPad, is it? What's it called? Tablet, thank you. Tablet. Is IHL ethically correct when recognising the principle of proportionality in war? There's so much there. Do you want to?
Well, I can try a few. I think we should keep sending them back to Mark Dubois. But actually, on Mark's point, because it relates to Katie's point a little, I had hoped in a way that this book would begin to do that process of, in a sense, it's like the way you describe it, being ethically fit. So the more we go through the exercises, the more we think about it, we get ethically fit and more responsive to recognizing the kind of problems we face, remembering experiences from before, and making good judgments and decisions. And I tried in parts of the chapters to set out quite systematic ways of categorizing problems and moral responsibilities. I don't know if it'll work, but I agree with you that it would be lovely if there was some kind of workbook and some kind of ability to help people get consciously. I mean, I think a lot of humanitarian workers are very good, actually, at, I hesitate to say, responding to their emotional sense of what is right and wrong, and then applying their reason and coming to the right call very often. But people sometimes disagree with that call, but they tend to make it. So it's about being ethically fit, I think. I also really think that idea you raised, Katie, of which is accountability, is also one of the reasons I tried to write this book. Because I do think, and I think Mansell said it as well, and other people have said it, that we need to be accountable more explicitly and consciously for the ethical choices we make in a program. And we're very good, and particularly at ALNAP, of evaluating things on the basis of their outputs and their coordination, their effectiveness and efficiency. And I think, as Alice said in her PhD thesis. We need to be focused on mission accountability, which means, how humanitarian have we been, how impartial have we been, etc., and what were the choices we made when faced with these difficult decisions. So I think we do need that workbook and that gap between ethics and policy filled so that it becomes a policy to account ethically. And I haven't got my ICRC hat on today, but if I did have it on, I would say, of course, ethics and policy are much closer at ICRC because we're constantly focused on being principled. And so we're always asking ourselves, how neutral are we being, how impartial are we being, what's the humanity question there, and so in a sense it's a bit DNA'd with us, I hope. But there is someone from ICRC here, so we can bounce it back to them. And I agree with that approach. I'm going to wait till Lucio's asked at least 10 more questions before I respond to his. All I would say to him on universality is, Lucio, if you're listening, one of the reasons I wrote the book, and I say it right in the introduction, is, look, this is where I write from, because this is my upbringing. I was born here. You look at me, you can tell what kind of a guy I am. So that's where I come from. And I write this book partly to get responses so that other people say, yeah, we agree with that, we don't agree with that. My feeling is that actually these ethics are, as Rhiannon said, universal. I think they are certainly sufficiently universal. Obviously there are people in places and at times who decide to pursue diametrically opposed ethics and actually decide it's right to kill, rape, torture, whatever. But I think generally we would say most people value the principle of humanity and impartiality. So I would hope they are universal, and I don't, it's like the human rights debate. Western is often Eastern anyway. I mean, if you look at historically, we were greatly informed by Islamic studies in the Middle Ages. It's all a mixture in some ways. Which brings me back to Jean-Michel's very interesting question, and I'd quite like to bat it back to you. I don't know, or others, which principle do people who are suffering in war and disaster have the most problem with? I mean, do they get most angry with our impartiality because they think, look, obviously feed us and our group first. How do you know they need more than us? Or do they get more impatient with our neutrality because we're not criticizing people who are hurting them? I don't know. Or do they... So I don't know the answer to that, actually. And of course, perhaps I should have done detailed field research. Next time. But I would encourage you to do that, and I'm sure people know in the room where people get most cross and angry with the principles, when they're hungry or destitute.
Jean-Michel, let's ask you. What's your view on that?
My view is that I don't think that people will challenge the impartiality and the humanity, but they will challenge some other principle that we put, which are, I think, more dictated by some of the accountability or all the systems that are put in place, which they will see are more system-driven and responding to an audience which is not them. Yeah. And we try to say, we want to be accountable to these people, to the people, and I think that they have a different perception, and they clearly we become heavy in the process, in delivery aid, rather than to be quick, needs-driven, and adapted. So I think that's they will challenge some of the one that we maybe don't speak too much about in the code of conduct. You mentioned that there is much more than the free or 2 or 3 universal ones.
That sounds right to me.
Yeah.
Can I respond to some of those things? Mentioned adapting to context. I didn't mean with that we start completely from scratch and anything goes. It is very much about different players and maybe around like who might the affected people be cross with most. I think it's about the whole package that some will be if you've got the ICRC and the MSF and everybody else in the middle there, then hopefully together as a sector we can hopefully respond to most of the things. So it's not then individual thing there. I think another aspect is are we only able to consider ethical issues when we respond? I mean, a key issue, what I mentioned in my introduction around theory versus practice, is we may want to respond based on humanity, but if you've got counterterrorism measures suggesting that if there is a suspicion of 5 cents of your money ending up in the hands of the Shabab, you can end up in jail for 14 years. You know, that kind of also refocuses the mind as to, I'd love to help based on humanity people in South Central. Unfortunately, from a personal and organizational survival point of view, I need to actually hope that the people leave the protection of South Central and their clan and move to Mogadishu, where actually as a sector we're making it worse for them because of the population density and they're much more eligible. Is that then the fault of the humanitarians that we didn't go into South Central and we forced people to come to Mogadishu? Or is that a wider society ethical issue? And is it that we then blame the aid workers so that actually it's off our plate? Or is it something that is genuinely then something that the aid workers should be more forceful about, saying, oh, nice and well, going against terrorists, and nobody likes terrorists. The thing is, you know, are you using a sledgehammer to crack a nut with that? And what Alice mentioned about ethics of justice versus ethics of charity, sometimes it's about, you know, humanitarian charities responding, but does that mean that actually the work we do is inspired for charitable reasons only? I think that also suggests like a moral superiority, saying, look how generous I am, me, white man or white woman from the West, coming to help these poor affected people. No, it's about, at least from Islamic teachings, and I think I had them before I converted, but I found them attractive in the way they were presented in Islamic teachings, is very much the affected people have a right to do so. The thing is, practically, how do we organize that? It's not about forcing people to, Alice, give me your tenor, Hugo, give me your tenor, but about people having their personal accountability, saying, can I, you know, stand up to God or the mirror, or if you're secular, about, do I feel comfortable with the level of support I've given, be that in physically giving money or not. So it's, you know, the envelope is charities like the Oxfams of this world, but actually the intention is very much about justice and personal accountability in achieving that. So,
thank you very much.
If
Alice,
I could come
please.
in there too on the accountability thing, I would pose another question back to you, but not to put you on the spot, is when affected people are citing accountability as one of the principles that they have issues with, I wonder if that's true accountability or if that's the kinds of accountability practices that are highly extractive and very donor-oriented. So I would wonder if that's true accountability to affected people, or how that's being implemented. And that accountability is also part of my answer to your question about what humanitarians should do in terms of making choices about testifying versus remaining silent in order to maintain their access or keep their access in certain situations. One of the things that's slightly puzzled me about the World Humanitarian Summit dialogue is how humanitarian actors we tend to talk about all humanitarian actors as if everyone is ICRC and MSF. And it's actually not the case, right? A lot of humanitarian NGOs are dual mandate. And so they don't operate in the same way. They don't, importantly for me, make claims in the same way that ICRC and MSF make claims as humanitarian actors, and therefore their responsibilities would differ. So, for example, this is just off the top of my head, but I would think a dual mandate organization has more of an obligation to testify because they're already engaged organizationally in political practices than perhaps the ICRC or MSF. I'm going out on, it's controversial, you might disagree. If you're part of that dual mandate organization, feel free. But the starting point and the ending point for me with ethics of any non-governmental, non-private sector organization is not the power that they hold, but how they get power. And they get power through the moral claims that they make, and that's then the reason why they need to be accountable as, for me, a fundamental moral obligation, to be accountable for how they get the powers that they are able to exercise, which is based on these mission statements and moral claims that they make for others. And so then that ties what kinds of actions they would be obliged to do or not be obliged to do. just to add to the point about universal humanitarian ethics, I think you can make, looking at the human rights case, you can make a clear case for overlapping consensus of different ethical systems that builds consensus around a set of core principles. I think there's also a secular tradition of social contract theory or contractualism, which involves treating others according to principles that they could not reasonably reject, and I think that's a viable possibility as well to be explored. The point about engaging with academics, I think, is a really important one. Just be prepared, if you talk to moral philosophers, to engage in endless trolley examples that make no sense, where you're pushing a fat person off of a bridge and trying to stop trolleys with other human beings. These are thought experiments that moral philosophers and academics like to use to understand our moral intuitions and obligations. But I think that what's critical there is to have that conversation, as you're saying, so that academics can learn about the realities of the humanitarian situation, and that we can also get a bit more professional input and feedback into the decisions that humanitarians have to grapple with.
Alice, thank you. Very quick point.
Yeah, just about the history of humanitarian ethics. Is Hugo referred to Aristotle, Socrates, and then quickly jumps to post-Enlightenment. And I've seen that in the field very much happening as well. When you try to teach about IHL and people from Middle East countries, for example, they say, oh, that seems quite relevant, or I seem to recognize that from my Islamic teachings. Like, oh, no, please don't get religion into this. This is a rational discussion about IHL, etc., etc. So then almost antagonizing exactly the people that you want to get on board, and suggesting that, the secular is better or higher morality than the religious one, and very much, almost secular proselytization of humanitarian ethics. And shouldn't that be actually a broader thing, saying if you're inspired to believe in those humanitarian ethics because of fairies, I don't care, as long as you believe in them. It shouldn't be more about that, as opposed to, oh, but you're inspired because of Islamic teaching. That won't do. You have to leave that at the door front, please.
Absolutely. Thank you. Please. More comment? Suzanne, hello.
Hello, I'm Suzanne Jaspers, just about to complete a PhD at Bristol University. I've got two questions, or rather two issues that I'm struggling with myself, and I'm hoping that you can help me with that. The first one is on long-term humanitarian crises. I mean, many of the places where aid workers are intervening today have received humanitarian assistance for many, many years. I've looked at food aid in my research, and food aid usually even longer than they've received humanitarian assistance. So yes, food aid can save lives in some situations, but you've also in those places got many, many years of unintended effects or unintended consequences. And certainly the people that I've talked to in Sudan, I mean, food aid is mostly seen as a political tool, whether it was provided for humanitarian purposes or, more explicitly, politically in the, from the 50s to the 80s or something. So, in those circumstances, I wish I could say it's possible to go back to some kind of pure humanitarianism. But I'm kind of, I guess my question is it too late, really, to be perceived as an ethical aid worker in, say, a place like Sudan, when, aid itself is seen as a political tool, aid workers are seen as Western spies? My second question is about access. Actually, in these same countries, access has been restricted, so you have to kind of remotely program, whether it's food aid or other interventions. So, my question is, how important is proximity to being an ethical aid worker? Once you lose that human contact, do you also lose a sense of kind of common humanity?
Suzanne, thank you very much for that. Is it too late to be an ethical aid worker? Interesting. Sir, please.
Not to be an ethical aid worker,
Oh,
be perceived
be perceived
as
as well. Sorry, I didn't.
Just that, not seen as
Fine.
Too late for us.
Thanks very much for your presentations, all super interesting. I'm Tom AD, I'm doing a master's at the LSE. I just had two questions. I know it's a bit cheeky to ask two questions. The first one was, is there a sort of culture of impunity within among humanitarian workers in the field, whereby people let themselves off the hook, and I mean kind of socially among humanitarian workers themselves, for committing things which had bad outcomes because they're kind of vindicated by the project of humanitarianism, which is kind of by intention good and about the alleviation of suffering. And if that culture exists, is it something that needs to be tackled as part of making humanitarianism more ethical? That's one question. And then the second question, I just wanted to respond to Alice's question about this point about is it intention or consequences that matter, and I wanted to suggest a possibility which I've just thought of, so maybe it's stupid, I apologise if it is, but whether it's possible that we should think of sort of organisations, humanitarian organisations, as having a sort of set of duties and responsibilities, and individuals having a set of duties and responsibilities, and that perhaps different principles might operate for them. And by that I mean in particular in terms of the intention versus consequentialism distinction you make. Maybe sort of when we think about a moral assessment of individuals, intention is perhaps more important in as much as if you do something bad but you're trying to do something good, well, you are a good person. Whereas in the case of organisations, we might think things like bounded rationality that apply to individuals maybe don't apply to organisations. They have different properties, and perhaps we need to hold them to a higher sort of consequential standard. So I wondered whether maybe there's actually not just one answer to this question about intention and consequences. Is it about the nature of the actor? Yeah.
Thank you, Tom. Did you say what you were studying?
Oh, no, I'm studying international development and humanitarian emergencies.
Okay, thank you.
Bit of a mouthful.
Can I have a second question? It's a very short one.
Go on.
It's just to give a twist to Susanne's second question on working in some of these high-risk areas. So I'm wondering, now that we work more and more with partners, particularly in high-risk areas, how ethical it is to transfer risk to these partners on the ground. That's it.
Another very good question. Hugo, would you like to reflect on one or two of those?
Yeah, I'm going to leave the difficult ones for the other panelists and Mark. Suzanne, yes, is it too late to be an ethical aid worker in... Perceived, yeah, to be perceived as an ethical aid worker in protracted conflicts where aid has become so instrumentalised and things? I don't know, really, is the answer. I think...
She wouldn't know, though, but she's been working in Sudan for 20 years.
So I'll believe you. I'll believe your view if you think it is too late. I don't know either. Well, I don't think it's ever too late. I don't think it's ever too late, because I think if you're trying to do good things and people need things, I find it impossible to think that it's too late to be an ethical aid worker or perceived as an ethical. And it doesn't matter if it's perception's a problem, but agencies should still, and individuals should still be trying to do what they think is the right thing to do in that situation. And then coming back to Katie's point, they should be able to say why they have stuck with it, even though they're perceived as doing something wrong. So then they're in a perception trap of some kind, but they have to keep doing what they think is right in that situation. I'm interested in Tom's point. I mean, there are lots of questions, but I'm interested in Tom's point about immunity, because I think it's a subtle point that actually, because we are a good profession, we tend to say, well, we were always trying to do good things, therefore when we screw up and we make terrible mistakes, which we've all done, somehow we get an immunity. It's possible, but I've always found the humanitarian profession hugely self-critical. And it's also ringed, particularly in the Anglo-Saxon world, well, actually not just, but with really deconstructing critical theoretical attacks on it by academics as well. So I think we're quite confessional as a profession, actually. But and I'm trying to think of my own mistakes, whether I'd sort of try and give myself immunity for what I got wrong. Probably we all do that a bit, but I think most agencies probably are more confessional, and they're heavily criticised, so they're very conscious of having to think about their acts quite often.
Very quickly,
yeah, come back.
Clarification on that. Do you think that applies also at the field level among... do you think that also applies I think that also applies in the kind of field level among workers, because there you talked about, I guess, sort of academic criticisms or criticisms that ALMAC might raise or other. So you're talking about the sort of system is self-critical and there isn't impunity at the system at a sort of system level. But I'm quite interested in sort of just as human beings.
Yeah, I mean, I others know this much better than me, but my experience also is that individual workers at field level, whoever they are, whether they're Sudanese staff or Colombians or whatever they are very aware of the ambiguity of their whole aims and activities, and they tend to, some of them become cynical, which is an indicator that they do feel that they're being asked to do bad things or things aren't really working or whatever. So I think they are self-critical at field level, but you'll have to discover that.
Anything to add?
Well, maybe around perception or not, is if we go into the aid world to become an aid worker, considering whether or not we're going to be perceived as ethical, don't we then lose our own ethics because of that? Should we not want to become an aid worker because we have our ethics? Doesn't matter what others think, is we might then inspire others and gradually change the compass back to being perceived as ethical. Isn't it ethically a bit of a cop-out if we say, well, this sector is a bit perceived as wrong, so I'll just leave the affected people to it because that'll make me feel better. What kind of ethical dilemma is that then? And there was another point, but I forgot it. I may think about it later.
Okay.
Just to pick up on a couple points, really interesting questions. I wanted to briefly touch on the issue of proximity, but mainly to say that I would love to read more on this, and maybe if Hugo wants to pick up on this point. I think the idea of solidarity with those in suffering is a completely distinct act from the act of assistance and aid, and has a totally different moral value and orientation. And I think it really isn't enough discussion about that in the sector at the moment when it comes to the ethics of assistance. And that's why we end up diverting so often into the consequentialist kind of argument about the impact and the effectiveness of assistance. I think solidarity is a fascinating moral concept, and one, I know MSF has probably done a lot of work on this, and one that perhaps needs broader and more consistent or persistent articulation. So I think it's hugely important, and at a different scale or a different kind entirely from the other endeavor of humanitarian action. I also had the similar point back about, is it a lot of navel gazing at the sector level? Is that kind of navel gazing, or not navel gazing, but reflective, critical inquiry happening at the field level? And I've never worked in the field, so hold up my hand on my ignorance of that situation on the ground. But what I've heard in our interviews around innovation is actually that highly critical and kind of fear of going the wrong way and having a huge aversion to risk is a huge impediment to innovations that could actually have a huge improvement for affected people. So in some sense, it is overly critical. On your point about splitting this between individuals and organizations, I think is really interesting, and actually points to the importance of, that often gets overlooked, the ethical importance of the snooze fest that is organizational HR policies and organizational frameworks for performance, because I think the link between organizational obligations to produce good consequences and individual freedoms to rely on their good intentions in the field is the framework that you have in place within the organization that links those missions and links the planning process so that individuals who are implementing projects can have the freedom to know that their good intentions are going to lead to good outcomes because they have a structure behind them that's in place to monitor quality and effectiveness. So I think that's an excellent point. I think I'll end with that.
Can I pick up on Tom's second point too? Because I also think it's an important question to ask, whether it's different ethically to be an individual or an organization. In other words, whether it's, slightly implying, is it easier to be ethical as an organization because you don't have bounded rationality, you've got better 360 vision of a problem. It's not my experience of organizations. I mean, and I think if you look at a lot of the big studies where organizations are hugely negligent or they do something disastrous, Volkswagen at the moment or something, you often will find, and we've all had organizations, I'm not singling them out, but you'll often find that actually bounded rationality is a major problem in organizations as well. They can't see everything, either because there are vested interests which make you not look, or so I don't think it's easier to be ethical as an organization than an individual. I really think ethical organizations are as problematic as ethical individuals. And in fact, very often it's ethical individuals that out unethical organizations. But it's a really key point about moral agency between, and it's related to a criminal, law question as well. Is do corporations have, legal criminal identity, and can they commit crimes?
Very quick. You
Yes.
remembered your points.
Sorry, I just came back from an intensive field trip with a big cold, so my brain's a bit fuzzy. Just on the point of intention versus consequence, I don't think it's either or. I mean, from Islamic teachings, to put it simplistically, you get one brownie point for a good intention and then another brownie point for a good outcome. So if you've had good intention but the outcome was bad, you're still accountable for that, but at least you've tried. But at least in that sense, you can't say good intentions are enough. You also need to have looked at the consequence of that, and you can't say, well, I achieved the good outcome, so it doesn't matter that my intention was naughty. You can't undo that bad intention with a good consequence that it worked out accidentally right. But the best outcome is good intention, 1 point, and then the good consequence, extra point. So you've got the focus and the encouragement to do both, not either or.
It seems unfair you only get one brownie point for the outcome.
Well, I don't know how God counts, but just, it's about the idea that it's not either or.
I'm sure in Christianity we double up at that point.
Brownie points is just easy language to convey.
No, it's true. I think the other reason it's true is because we know it's true. And that comes back to that we feel it's true. We feel it's true that a really good action, real goodness, flows beyond intention to action. We know that.
Let's test that.
Because we're morally emotional.
We haven't got very much longer, Hugo, and because ALNAP's involved in the launch here, I feel that the ALNAP members would want me to ask you a question.
Easy question.
No, it's not an easy question, but I think they'd want me to ask it to you. How can ethics improve the performance of humanitarian aid?
Well, I think we've already heard around the room how we think it can, because I think we recognize that as a profession we have ethically constructed objectives to, save lives, respect the human person, to do that with a radical equality for everyone impartially. And the best way we feel we can do that is by positioning ourselves in conflicts in a neutral, independent way. And all those other dignity things that we do it, the means with which we work with people when they're suffering are dignifying rather than undignifying, and they are sustainable and accountable. So I think if we were really to evaluate humanitarian action, that's what we would do. We would look at how it saved life, how it respected the human person in the process of that, how it increased dignity, and how it was accountable and sustainable in some ways. So I think our ethics automatically design our evaluation framework. So we should do much more of that. So I would expect in future to see ALNAP really requesting much more from evaluations about, did you meet your ethical aims as a humanitarian profession? Not just, did you meet the donor's aims for coordination, collective action, efficiency, effectiveness, value? Did you do what you said you would do as a profession?
Hugo, I can't think of a better place to stop there. That's perfect, perfect. Look, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of this. We could go on for a lot longer, but I'd like to thank our online participants for their questions. I'm sorry we didn't get around to all of them. There were so many we couldn't. I'd like to thank Alice, Brianne and Hugo very much for really, really interesting discussion. Hugo, very best of luck with the book. And I'd like to thank you all for coming and engaging with very, very thought-provoking questions. And you're all welcome to join us now for a little drink. So thank you very much.